I think it's November 24th, 2014. Plattsburgh, the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base. This room should be familiar with most of our hometown cable television viewers. We've been here many times. I've been here many times when there weren't any TV cameras here. It's a wonderful place. The Battle of Plattsburgh, War of 1812 Museum. Vince Puliafico?
Puliafico.
Puliafico.
Yes, Puliafico.
AKA.
John Quincy Adams.
And why are we doing this? Well, first of all, we've wanted to do this for a long, long time. But
Yes.
we're doing this at a time that was pretty darn busy 200 years ago. Right, Vince?
Absolutely, yes, sir.
Why John Quincy Adams? What was your attachment, besides the fact that he stayed in a hotel in your hometown in Ware, Massachusetts?
Well, when I was reading and studying about the War of 1812, I became a docent here at the Interpretive Center. And I didn't have a costume at the time. So around 2009, I was showing this visitor around, and I was talking about the Treaty of Ghent print that we have in the back. And he says, you know, you look a little bit like that guy.
Oh, come on.
So a few $100.
That's where it started?
That's where it started. A few $100 later, I had this costume made locally, and that's where it started. And then I started researching into his life, his involvement in the War of 1812, which was short, only about 6 months. So that's how I got into this costume.
And into the persona very well, because you're probably better known in that costume than you are in your civilian gear.
That's true. That's true. I pretty much stay to myself. I don't go out partying and so forth, just like John Quincy, actually. So
You love history.
I do.
Calvin and I love history. We followed so much of the North Country's history, and you can't do that without becoming involved in the battle or the battles of Plattsburgh, as Keith Herculoe calls them. And I wasn't kidding when I said it was a busy time 200 years ago. And if it hadn't been for this guy in this costume, our United States of America would have been a little bit different today than it was, because John Quincy Adams had an idea when he went over there to Ghent.
Yep.
Tell people about
Well-
where Ghent is.
Ghent, Belgium is located about 200 miles east of London, England. So it's very close to them, as opposed to 3,000 miles from America. So it was an advantage for the British to have the negotiations close. John Quincy was minister to Russia from 1809 to 1814. Then he was selected to be on this commission to go to Ghent to treat peace. And excuse me, I'm losing track of what I'm saying.
Well, you went to Ghent. John Quincy Adams
Yes,
went to Ghent.
he went to Ghent with 4 other gentlemen. One was the Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin. One was Henry Clay. He was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. And the other 2 gentlemen were senators. So Madison picked a pretty powerful team to go over there and treat for peace. The British had Lord Gambier. He was 57 years old at the time. They had Henry Goulburn was Under Secretary of War for the colonies at the time, but he disliked everything that was American. Did not like the Americans at all, but he had a lot of expertise in the American territories, so that's one of the reasons why they picked him to go there. And the other gentleman that was on the British side was a lawyer in maritime law. So they didn't have quite as strong a team as the Americans had.
It's interesting because Ghent is only, as you said, a few days away from London.
Yep,
And so word could travel back to London in a few days.
right. Well,
The Americans were over here, and it was several weeks, maybe 5 or 6 weeks before the information could get
Absolutely.
back here.
for sure. That's it would take about 5 or 6 weeks for information to get back and forth, or just actually one way across the ocean. It didn't move unless it was by sailboat or saddlebag.
Think
And
about it.
if the wind wasn't blowing, you weren't going. John Quincy mentioned one time in his diary that they They finally got a good wind. They left port and they sat out in the harbor for 3 days because they lost the wind. No wind.
No Facebook, no face-to-face communications,
Yeah.
no telegrams, no telephones,
Yeah.
no shortwave radios.
Yeah.
And that's why, that's why the negotiations went on and on and on. And it was very difficult. I mean, I'm sure there are people watching this program who know a lot about the Battle of Plattsburgh and the date it was fought in Cumberland Bay. Plattsburgh, right off the coast of Plattsburgh here on Lake Champlain. Many of them might not ever have heard of the Treaty of Ghent. The Treaty of Ghent was necessary to end this cotton picking
Right.
War of 1812, but communications being what they were, I'm sure you've been to New Orleans.
Me, I have not been to New Orleans.
Well, the guys who do what you do here talk about the Battle of New Orleans, and they talk about the Battle of Plattsburgh, even though here in Plattsburgh we seldom talk about the Battle of New Orleans.
Yes.
And that was almost an afterthought, wasn't it?
That's for sure. In fact, the original plan that the British had was a four-pronged plan to attack America. They wanted to attack and capture Maine. They wanted to harass the East Coast, the Chesapeake area, Baltimore, Washington. They wanted to attack New Orleans, and the main offensive was going to come down through the Champlain Valley. Well, this four-pronged attack had to develop, and they thought it was going to be a combined attack of all these areas about the same time. But what happened was one of the prongs failed from the day it started in the Chesapeake. When General Ross, he was going to command the land attack in New Orleans, he was killed at the Battle of North Point. So what happened was they had to send a letter back to London and say, "Oh my God, we lost our general." They had to send someone else back to be the land commander, which turns out to be the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington, Edward Pakenham. So that delay caused the New Orleans campaign and part 3 of this four-pronged attack to fail from the very beginning. So all that time, and not the time that the New Orleans attack finally started in the same week that the Treaty of Ghent got on a sailboat to come back to America in January of 1815.
And, you know, in retrospect, we can totally understand how that happened. But there were so many different things involved in those negotiations with John Quincy Adams, not the least of which was our binocular view of Canada from here and how much we wanted some of that territory. It had to do a lot with the Indian territories, right?
Yes.
In the West.
Absolutely. That was, actually, that surprised the American negotiators when the British brought that up. That was one of the first things the British asked for, was they wanted a nation or a homeland for the Native Americans.
They wanted a buffer zone.
A buffer zone, they called it. Which was, what was it, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, maybe even more. But it surprised the Americans, and the British, the next day, were surprised to hear that the Americans had no instructions on how to treat the Indian issue.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And what turned out in all those intense negotiations and how it ended, and by the end of it all, both sides were kind of sick of the war, I think, don't you?
That's true, that they had been in war for many years with Napoleon, and they had beat Napoleon in April of 1814, but by December, when they were really hashing out the words of this treaty, there was signs that Napoleon was going to come back to power. And that changed a little bit. That influenced their decisions on how to end their part of the war. Why were they getting out of the war?
So there were, what, 15 articles
That
you went over there with?
Well, the original treaty or project that the Americans presented to the British was 15 articles. And when the British got it, they crossed out this one, they
Little
crossed
bit
out
of
that
this,
one,
little bit of
changed the
that.
words. It went down to 10 articles on December 1st. And then by another conference and more notes and letters and some more editing, it brought it back up to 11 articles.
Thank God John Quincy Adams had a diary.
For sure.
That makes your role
Absolutely.
here
Very,
in,
very lucky
in
to have that.
2014 a lot easier than it would have been if you'd had a scrounge.
Yep. I have so much to say about his diary. I've read a lot of it. He meticulously kept his diary for 68 of his 80 years on Earth.
No kidding.
Yep.
Some people do that.
I held the diary he wrote in when he was 12
You're kidding me.
at the
You are
Massachusetts
kidding
Historical
me.
Society.
Oh, my.
And you know what? No gloves between me and that diary.
How is that
They,
possible?
they say that if you put gloves on or any type, it damages the paper more than the oils from your skin.
Never knew that until right now.
Yep.
If
It was
we
in a
never learn
vault.
another thing tonight, that's an amazing revelation.
It's in a vault upstairs in the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I held the diary that he wrote in June of 1812 when the Americans declared war on Britain. And for his diary, I have a section there that just clearly shows that when the news of the Battle of Plattsburgh reached there, it changed the status of the negotiations. To me, that was decisive. You've probably heard many people say the Battle of Plattsburgh was decisive. Well, this was decisive when it got there. I could read some quotes.
We would like to do that. What I want to do is pause for a moment, then we're going to collect our thoughts and move forward. Vince, I'm so happy I came here finally to meet you, John Quincy Adams. Let's pause for a minute. Vince, it dawns on me before we get into your wonderful slide presentation that you've got a history here. We've all got a history
Yes,
here.
we have a history here. Gordon.
Former Plattsburgh Air Force Base.
Yes.
Give us a little bit of the background.
Okay, I joined the Air Force in 1973. Went through the boot camp. They sent me up to Plattsburgh, working on the flight simulators here.
Oh,
You remember that, don't you,
oh,
Gordon?
so well.
We took, at the closing of the base, we took a ride in the simulator together.
Yes, we did. You and me.
Yep.
And you
Anyways.
didn't have your hat on at nose.
No. But after I was here a while, they gave me orders to Germany. I went to Germany, spent my time over there. When I came back, I exited the Air Force, and I went to work for the company that made the simulators. At that time, it was the Singer Link Flight Simulation Division. And they said, hey, you have experience in Plattsburgh, you want to go back? So I came back up here in January of 1979. I was living out on Cumberland Head, and I met a lady out there, and we got married. We have one kid, and I've been here ever since. I love it. It's the area, the history here, the old road to war it's fascinating to me.
How can you not feel the history when you stand in any of these buildings? When you walk around the area, we just got news about that wonderful old stone barracks, and the reuse plan will be underway. It's been announced by the time you watch this on television that we're going to have a local brewery in there.
Oh, wow.
Some people formerly from Plattsburgh and people who were associated with the United States Armed Forces are coming in there. We're going to have a heritage trail, an interpretive trail that goes through the property. Things that I've dreamed about for a long, long time in saving the old
that's
stone
great.
barracks have been announced as we're doing this on the 24th of November. So there's so much history around here, I can feel it in my bones. This very building is historical, as is the building across the street. We now have a fabulous museum campus here on the former Plattsburgh
do.
Air Force Base for
Yes.
people who are watching this. So you got your roots down like I got my roots down. and you couldn't get away. It's almost like tentacles, isn't it? Huh?
For sure.
It grabs you and holds you.
Yeah, I think I'll put my roots here in the passing life. I'm just going to stay right here.
Well, I have great admiration for people like you and anybody who's passionate about history, especially people like you who can keep that history alive and bring it alive year after year after year. Calvin and I have done enough shows connected with the Battle of Plattsburgh since I left the radio business many, many years ago, and Calvin even before that. So we've learned a lot about the history, but every time I talk to somebody like you, Vince, I get a new addendum to my master's degree in Plattsburgh history.
Well, that's great. I'm
And
glad.
you know, for you, it was a big learning curve too, wasn't it, when you started?
It was. In fact, my first introduction to the War of 1812 was back in, I think it was 1996 or 97. The mayor of the city of Plattsburgh decided to create this interpretive center upstairs in City Hall. They were looking for volunteers to help set it up. And I volunteered. I wasn't on the original commission, but I was a volunteer to help in any way I could. And I started reading and reading more and more, and before you know it, 2009 I had this on. 2010 I came out with my first book, and then in 2012 I came out with my second, and I can't stop.
I love to
I can't stop.
rub shoulders with famous people. I think Calvin and I were up in that interpretive center when it first opened to do a television
were.
program.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it or seen it for many, many years. A little water over the proverbial dam since those
for
days.
sure.
But we have come a long way. We've all had dreams that we could perpetuate this great passion for the Battle of Plattsburgh, the history of this North Country, and here we are, having celebrated the 200th anniversary. And just before Calvin hit the red button that says record a few minutes ago, you said this very date, November 24th, is significant.
It is significant for the American envoys. After they had started negotiating with the British, letters moved slowly across the Atlantic Ocean, and on this day, they received a letter from Secretary of State James Monroe telling them that, hey, it's unfortunate that we haven't been able to continue the war the way we wanted to. The British aren't doing any better than us, so let's treat on the basis of status quo ante bellum. So shortly after that, the Americans proposed to the British status quo ante bellum. They wanted to treat for who owned or who had possession or occupation of the territory at the time.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
So here we are. You've
Yep.
written a couple of books. What are the books?
One book is named The History of the Seal Used by John Quincy Adams from 1784 to 1817.
Wow.
And the other book is John Quincy Adams, I'm sorry.
We can stop.
The second book I wrote was
Yeah.
John Quincy Adams, his role in the War of 1812 at the Treaty of Ghent. So it's very specific to what happened in his lifetime for that 6 months in Ghent, Belgium.
We're so glad that you chose John Quincy Adams. You could have chosen somebody else.
Well,
Well, what the heck? He stayed in a
the
hotel
reason
in
I
your
did
hometown.
that, Gordy, one day there was a visitor here at the interpretive center. I was at Dawson at the time, and we were talking about the print
Yeah.
of the Treaty of Ghent, and he said, "You know, you look a little bit like
Yeah,
that
you
guy
said
in the
that.
painting."
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And so you've done your best to
Yeah.
fill that persona. When you're just going to sleep at night, do you ever feel like you might be in the mind of John Quincy Adams?
I can't get him out of my mind, actually.
Is that really true? You know, we know extremely talented people over the years who most of them are comedians because I love comedy. Well, I'm thinking of Jonathan Winters, who would get so much into a persona
Oh, my gosh.
that he had to claw his way back sometimes. And you know, people like you who are reenactors, it's not just a play anymore.
Right.
It becomes
It-
real.
Yes, it does, for sure.
So you felt that way,
I did.
especially when you had the diary to read. Have you read most of it by now? How long is it?
68 years of writing.
Pages and
No,
pages?
I haven't read all of it, but in my
Is it easy
search,
to read?
very easy.
Yeah.
It's very easy. He wrote in pen, quilt pen, and eventually, as the pencils became common, he changed his writing styles. But it's very easy to read. Very little marks. In fact, you could read page after page after page. No cross-outs, no
Isn't that
erasures.
right?
It's
I guess he
almost
didn't have a
perfect.
delete button or a backspace. And
Yeah,
that-
no white outer.
Oh, what a difference between then and now. And that's
Yeah.
why some people are going back to cursive writing. I know a lot of
Yeah.
very good authors who only write in longhand on yellow paper. And
Yep.
some are going back to typewriters because it's not so easy to correct their mistakes. And the more things stay the same, the more they change and go backwards.
Yep.
So you put together this presentation.
Yes.
And as we're doing this on November 24th, you're planning a public presentation on the 1st of December.
Yes, I am. That'll be at the Clinton County Historical Association, 7 p.m. Monday night, December 1st.
And did it take you a long time to put it together?
No, actually, it was propagation from other programs that I've had in the past. I've been into Eastport, Maine. I've given a presentation out there. I've given a presentation to the Rotary Club and to the Retired Teachers Association. I give a presentation here. So it's developing and evolving as time goes on. I think you'll be entertained, if not excited about what I have to
I
say.
certainly will be educated because, we hope that this part of this North Country history and American history will be taught accurately in the schools. And young teachers sometimes get a paragraph or two where they've studied it, and it's either misinformation or inadequate in terms of its scope. So that's why when you give this presentation to teachers, they can in turn
Oh, sure, of course.
send it out
yeah.
to the students, and we'll have a generation of kids who understand.
I remember talking to a person about it, about my program, and was showing him, and he was interested in it. And I kept talking about various aspects, and he said, "Wow." He was
Wow.
one of those kind
I
of
love
persons.
it. Yeah.
And a few paragraphs later, he'd say, "Wow." And he must have said "wow" about 7 times
Yeah, that's
through
good. That's
talking
good.
with him, and I knew I was getting across to him.
I love it. What do you say we do the presentation?
Okay.
Okay, go right ahead any way you want to, Vince.
Okay. You know what I got to do? I'll put this together.
Okay, go right ahead, Vince.
Okay. When a person looks back at the War of 1812, they ask, who won? What did we gain? What was resolved? With the help of John Quincy Adams' diary, I'm going to chronologically present to you the negotiations at the Treaty of Ghent. John Quincy Adams meticulously kept his diary for 68 of his 80 years on Earth, and including everything that was said and the people he met at Ghent, Belgium. The diary is important in my presentation because it's the basis of my talk, and very specific things are said about the Plattsburgh. Ghent, Belgium is located about 200 miles east of London, England. John Quincy's role in the War of 1812 was short, about 6 months. He was foreign minister to Russia in St. Petersburg from 1809 to 1814, when he was selected to be the chair of the American negotiating team. In 1811, he was horrified when he heard the news that America was heading towards war again. He remembers what it was like in 1776, and he wished he could talk to his father, John Adams. This is a painting.
I love it. Calvin and I have been together long enough so we kind of read each other's minds, and I was just thinking, my God, he looks just like him. So that guy was perfectly,
He was right.
Right, come on over here. We just wanted to get that picture so our viewers could say, this couldn't be perfect, more perfect. This is by some kind of divine design
Like I
that
said,
you're doing this.
John Quincy stayed in a hotel in my hometown.
And I said where, and you said where, and
I don't know if he planted a seed down there and it's gone on a generation, but
I love to study these kinds of things because I have a very strange mind. And I believe there is some kind of a grand design for all of us. And you have fallen into step with the design that was planned for you. And as you stood next to John Quincy Adams' picture there, I could almost hear a little chuckle up above saying, well done, my faithful servant, well done. All right, I didn't mean to interrupt you in the middle of your presentation, but that was so important that we get you standing there. You are John
Thanks for
Quincy Adams,
recognizing.
Vince. Go right ahead and finish up
Okay.
now. I love it.
Okay, so this is a painting by Gilbert Stuart of John Quincy when he became the 6th president of the United States in 1825. And he was actually the first president to have his photograph taken, but not until 1843.
I didn't know that.
Yes,
If
he
I did,
was.
I forgot. Wow.
So, in 1813, Russia, being a neutral country, offered to mediate between Great Britain and the United States. President Madison was happy to accept that, and he quickly sent envoys to Russia, shown here. Gallatin was the Secretary of the Treasury. Bayard was a senator from Delaware. But Great Britain preferred direct negotiations. So Madison accepted those direct negotiations in February of 1814. A lot of the war has been going on since then. He sent new commissioners, Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, and Jonathan Russell was another senator. You can see that Madison is building a pretty powerful political team for his negotiations. So let me explain a little bit about how we got into the war. For several years prior to the War of 1812, Great Britain and France were in this life and death struggle to control Europe. France didn't want us trading with England. They said we were feeding the British armies. Great Britain, with the largest navy in the world, said trade with us or not at all. They imposed trade restrictions, blockading ports, stopping and searching our commercial shipping, impressing our sailors to fight on British warships. Basically, this was interference with our independence. You can see on the map here in 1812, Napoleon had control of Europe. Great Britain was busy in Europe with the war until April of 1814, when they helped force Napoleon to abdicate his throne. By 1814, all of this blue and purple is now red for British and Russian control. Since the war was over and all those troops were available, Great Britain could focus on that little problem in America. They devised a plan in the military secret orders, and they sent them to Sir George Prevost, the Governor General in Canada. The secret orders were written in June of 1814. They were designed to attack America. Now it's a new war. They have 3 goals in mind: provide security for Canada, a home for the Native Americans, and a piece of Maine to provide land communication between Halifax and Quebec City. But in Ghent, since the British had wrote the secret orders, the British plan was to wait for the news of their predicted victories in this 4-prong attack on America. Maine, New Orleans, the Chesapeake, and the main offensive was going to come down the northern section of New York. So I want to fast forward just a little bit. The raids at Washington being burned in Baltimore provided a distraction for the main offensive coming from the north. Later, Washington was viewed as a raid for revenge. But Baltimore, more importantly from a British point of view, was the loss of Ross. General Ross was going to command the land attack on New Orleans. It's important to understand this 4-prong attack. After their win over Napoleon, the British were very confident. They had no reason to doubt the success in this plan. And I'll discuss each prong of this attack as we go along. The replacement for General Ross's death delayed the New Orleans campaign and was eventually not a factor at the negotiations. So part 3 of this 4-prong attack is doomed. When the teams finally sat down on August 8, 1814, 1 month before the Battle of Plattsburgh, The British opened the talks by stating their demands as if they were already victorious. They will not renew fishing privileges in the Bay of Fundy granted to us in the treaty that ended the American Revolution. They demand a U.S.-Canadian boundary revision and a nation or a buffer state for the Native Americans. The British also mentioned their use of impressment and that it was not negotiable.
Oh, yeah.
So this buffer state they were proposing was to include the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, maybe even more. And this is important thing to realize here, that the British are dictating the terms of peace. It's not negotiating. The Americans are surprised by the British demands. They don't have authority to, and they won't give up American territory. So the first day ended. August 9th, the next day, Americans told the British they refused to negotiate the Indians because our government hasn't given us instructions on how to treat them. We want a definition of blockade. We want to clarify the rights of neutral countries, especially in regards to commercial trade. At the time, we were a neutral country between France and Great Britain. We want claims of indemnities and restitution for captured American ships and supplies. The Americans dropped the primary cause of the war, impressment of our sailors, was dropped from discussion because Great Britain's war with Napoleon was over in April of 1814. So there was no need for impressment anymore. Well, they went back to their chambers, and the next conference was not held until August 19th, actually my wife's birthday.
Aha!
And this was the last face-to-face meeting until December 1st. English newspapers were reporting the capture of Eastport, Maine, and bad news from the Niagara frontier. This gave the British more leverage in the peace talks. New demands were presented by the British. Now they want Americans to withdraw and disarm the Great Lakes area. They want navigation rights on the Mississippi. And worst of all, the British insist on this buffer state for the Indians, or there isn't going to be a treaty. The Americans are stunned. They feel there's no hope for peace at this point. In August, they begin to pack their bags in preparation to leave. So I want to describe John Quincy's relation with some of the other envoys. John Quincy was described as having a prickly personality, a bad temper, but he was exceptionally bright. He was an experienced foreign minister, a little pessimistic and stubborn at times as well.
I love it.
Henry Clay had bad habits of staying out late, card parties, gambling, drinking late, and sleeping late. Adams noted in his diary a couple of times that while he was getting up in the morning, Henry Clay's card party was just breaking up. So here's the painting of the Treaty of Ghent, painted by Sir Amity Foster in 1914 for the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Ghent. Now it's the 200th anniversary, and I hope everybody can celebrate the peace with a party. Maybe have a Belgian beer or have some Belgian waffles. I did.
I love it.
No taps. No more ceremonies, no more commemorations. It's time to party.
Yeah.
The painting is actually in the Smithsonian. It's about the size of a 42-inch flat-screen TV.
Yes, it is.
pretty
I've
good
seen
size.
it. So have you, I bet.
great. No, I haven't
you
seen it.
haven't.
I haven't been
Come
there.
on.
I have seen pictures of the back of it. That's what I was interested in.
I should have known.
The British, on the left side of this is Navy Admiral Lord Gambier, shaking John Quincy's hand there. He was 57 years old at the time. John Quincy was 47 at the time. Dr. Adams is a lawyer in maritime law. He's no relation to John Quincy. Henry Goulburn is the gentleman with his back turned. He was the most diplomatic with expertise in the American colonies, but he dislikes everything that is American. Anthony St. John Baker is the man with the binder. He was the secretary of the British side. So they don't really have a strong political team, so to speak. Christopher Hughes he has the red binder in his hand. He was the secretary of our commission. So put yourself in the shoes of the Americans. They're 3,500 miles from home. News comes slowly by sailboat and saddlebag. A lot of news came via British newspapers. They were faced with facts that left them with no delusions. Try to remember a few of these facts as we go through the next couple of slides. You won't have to hold that information for very long. But they knew that Maine was going to be captured. They knew Admiral Cochrane was harassing the east coast of America, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Stonington, Connecticut, Essex, New London. Maine was captured. They knew the British public lustily demanded vengeance for America attacking a British colony, which was Canada at the time. And now they know peace would not include the maritime issues that they brought forward on the second day of the negotiations. They knew that the Treasury was out of money. They couldn't fund another year of war. And worst of all, the envoys knew about this large British force heading for America. Nobody knew its destination, but we'll find out soon.
Oh, yes, we will.
So back in Ghent, in September, John Quincy realized, hey, the British are stalling for time. They're waiting for their plans to develop this four-prong attack. Since the August 19th conference, no meetings were held, but many notes and letters had passed between the British and the American envoys. Back in America, in September, as part of the four-prong attack, the British had captured Plattsburgh on September 6th. Sir George Prevost and his 10,000-man army were waiting for the British fleet to arrive to begin the combined attack to take the forts and take control of Lake Champlain. The attempt will happen on September 11th. So you know that Fort Moreau is over here by the chapel on the Oval. Fort Scott is due east of that, right on the shore of Lake Champlain, and Fort Brown is on Route 9 over near the Roche-Kier area.
Yeah.
So now we're up to the important month of October, 1814. In the first week, let me explain a little bit about this slide. The capture of Maine happened in July through September. The raids at Washington and Baltimore was in September and August. And the main offensive is going to be repelled in Plattsburgh on September 11th. And all this news is finally getting to Ghent in October. So the first week of October, news arrived in Ghent of the burning of the White House and the Capitol in Washington and other buildings on August 24th, and more losses in the Niagara area. The British put pressure on the Americans in demanding an Indian article in the treaty. This was presented as a make-or-break situation for the Americans. There was a real threat and possibility of failure at the peace table. The Chesapeake, which was part 2 of that four-prong attack, was a success for Great Britain at the negotiations. Remember that list I told you about that the envoys knew? Maine, the maritime issues, East Coast raids, the large British force. Well, this is the President's house burning. With this news, now heavy on the minds of the envoys, was America conquered? What news would be in the next saddlebag? Where was the President? He can't be here. The whole government of the United States was riding around on horseback at the end of August and early September. Will there be a home to go home to if they break off the negotiations? The Americans had a dilemma. So they decided, or they resolved, to hold out as long as possible without breaking off the negotiations. No matter what they threw at them, they decided to hold off. So now I'm going to enter some very important parts of John Quincy Adams' diary. On October 12th, John Quincy wrote, quote, "The tone of all the British notes is arrogant, overbearing, and offensive. We agreed to accept the article offered us as an ultimatum," unquote. The Americans agreed to include an Indian article in the treaty against their authority to do so, but they wanted to keep the talks alive. So, another quote in his diary. Now, let me explain this slide a little bit here. You can see what the picture down below is John Quincy's handwriting. In red is what it says down below, and it's about the news of the capture of Plattsburgh. And I have more to go along with that section you see on the screen. Quote, "The Times of the 10th and the 11th, containing the official accounts of the taking of Machias and other towns in the Passamaquoddy Bay, together with our attempt to take Michilimackinac in Upper Michigan, and the taking of Plattsburgh by the British-Canadian Army," unquote. The British captured and occupied half of Maine. The envoys didn't have the news about the battle on Lake Champlain yet. Maine is part one of their four-prong attack, another success for Great Britain at the negotiating table. So that's 2 out of 4 prongs, and their expectations were very high for the main offensive coming down the Champlain Valley. This news put Great Britain in a very strong negotiating position. The Americans asked themselves, what next? Well, what happened next was the next saddlebag came in with news on October 21st. A letter arrived regarding the British attempt to take Baltimore. Bombs bursting in air, rockets' red glare. The good news was that we were able to defend it. However, alone, it was not decisive enough to change the status of the negotiations. The truly devastating news for the British that the main objective of the British plan had failed was entered in John Quincy Adams' diary on October 28th. Quote, "He brought some further accounts from America, particularly of the defeat of the British on Lake Champlain and the subsequent retreat of Sir George Prevost and his army. The complaints against Prevost filled the London papers of the 22nd, unquote."
Of course they did.
Yeah. The unbelievable news mortified the British, and it ruined their plan for security of Canada. So, part 4 of the four-prong attack failed. The main offensive, zip. Everyone knew in London and Ghent the significance of the British reversal at Plattsburgh. For the American envoys, it was too good to be true. But it was exactly what they were hoping for. Quote on the same day, "In the evening, we all attended a party. There were between 40 and 50 ladies, about the same number of men. There was music, dancing, and cards. We came home about midnight," unquote. Now, for John Quincy Adams, and I know him pretty good, it had to be a momentous event, since he despised the habits of some of the other envoys and their habits of card parties, drinking, and staying out late. Now he's out with them. The U.S. Commission now feels that they might have the upper hand at returning to the negotiating table. Remember, since August 19th, there hasn't been any face-to-face meetings, and here we are near the end of October. So the next day, and let me back up a little. Every day, the American Commission has a meeting to discuss the business and the letters that they're writing and so forth. So on October 29th, he wrote that after the meeting, he wrote that I urge the priority of making out at once a project in the form of a treaty. Now here, John Quincy, as the chair of the commission, feels the time is right. No more notes, no more letters. Write down article by article what we want in a treaty and be ready to present it to the British. Now, you have heard the word decisive connected with the Battle of Plattsburgh. Many people say it was the most decisive battle of the War of 1812. Ladies and gentlemen, this was decisive. October 29th is the turning point in the negotiations for the American envoys because of the Battle of Plattsburgh. Ask yourself, what if we lost the Battle of Plattsburgh? There would be no project and no party as mentioned in Adams' diary. I think at the next conference, the British would have stated what they want in the treaty. And I think what they wanted was to draw a new border from Lower Maine through New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, to Lake Ontario. Kingston, Ontario, at the source of the St. Lawrence Seaway, is the major British naval base there. Across the river from that was Sackett's Harbor. So the control of both banks of the St. Lawrence Seaway was important to them, and the control of Lake Champlain, the old road to war. And the larger distance from the new border to the major cities in Canada would have provided more security for Canadian cities. Now, with New England in economic disaster because of the war, they were leaning towards separation, and it may have broken the Union and forced Madison out of office. So put yourself in John Quincy's shoes now. October 29th. He writes in his diary every day. He writes the time he gets up, 5 o'clock in the morning on those cold November mornings. He rolls out of bed. He lights a candle. He goes over and pokes his fireplace. He warms his fingers and continues writing this project or draft of a treaty. The other envoys are doing exactly the same thing. They all had a part to write in the treaty, various articles. And they would hash it out from October 29th until November 10th. They were hashing it out, the words, before they submit it. So on November 10th, which happens to be my wedding anniversary,
Oh, here we go again.
Americans submit a project in the form of a treaty to the British. Now, something I found recently was that on November 11th, John Quincy wrote to his wife, not my wife, his wife. All the letters from England concur in stating that the popular sentiment for continuing the war is a perfect frenzy. The Times of London blubbers that all the laurels of Portugal, Spain, and France have withered at Plattsburgh, and threatens damnation to the ministry if they dare to make peace with Madison and his faction, unquote. The British public is saying, fight on, avenge Plattsburgh, don't make peace. Gordy, our 9/11 shook the world from Plattsburgh
It
to
certainly
Ghent,
did.
Belgium.
This proves it.
Yep.
I love it.
More British orders were sent to the generals in America. Take New Orleans and continue fighting. And then, this is the Duke of Wellington. He was the hero that forced Napoleon out of Spain, Portugal, and France. He was basically the Norman Schwarzkopf of the time. He was,
yeah.
At the time of this painting, he was ambassador to France. He was field marshal, basically in charge of all the armies there. He's the one that sent a lot of his troops over here. So reviewing the past 12 days from a British perspective, the British cabinet asked the Duke of Wellington to go to America. On November 4th, the Duke wrote back to London that he would go to America just to silence the public and has no objection to going to America at all. But for the next 5 days, the Duke must have struggled with the news of the British reversal at Plattsburgh. Then on November 9th, he wrote again that if he goes to America, he doesn't promise himself much success because of the lack of naval superiority on the lakes. In a letter, he also said, quote, "You have no right from the state of war to demand any concession of territory from America," unquote. He had urged quick settlement. London considers the Duke's recommendations as decisive.
Isn't that amazing?
They had to back off on their demands. On November 26, they returned the draft of a treaty with alterations back to the American Commission. Now, the treaty is passed back and forth between the Americans and the British 5 times for alterations through December. Now they're negotiating. Before the Battle of Plattsburgh, it was British demands, and Americans were holding out, and so now they're really negotiating. New instructions arrived during that time from the Secretary of State to treat on the basis of status quo antebellum. Status quo antebellum means return everything back to the way it was prior to the war. Other news influenced the British decisions. There was tension between England and Russia over how to divide up Europe in this post-Napoleonic era. That was the Congress of Vienna. Unrest in England over more taxes to continue the war. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Uncertainty in France that might bring Napoleon back to power. They need the Duke in Europe. So the British now have a dilemma. Do they fight on or get out? London wants out of this war too. They agree to the American proposal of status quo antebellum. So here's another map I want to explain. In December, the British controls all these red dots here. They could attack these areas at any time, again, all along the East Coast. They had captured and occupied most of Maine. They control this fur trading post out here in Wisconsin, Upper Michigan, Michigan-Mackinac. They control Lake Huron, some of the Niagara area. They don't have Lake Erie because of Perry's victory there. They have Kingston, Ontario, and they have Ogdensburg. They control basically the St. Lawrence Seaway. But they don't have Plattsburgh, their main goal. So at the conference on December 12th, the British wanted an exception to status quo antebellum. They want ote possidetis, which means keep what you gained by force. They wanted ote possidetis in regards to the possession of the islands in the Passamaquoddy Bay. Moose Island in Eastport, Maine is mentioned 12 times in his diary. It had to be a significant part of this negotiations. Eastport, Maine is that very eastern portion of Maine there. The Americans didn't give in. They said no. Status quo antebellum. Well, let me tell you, that didn't go over very well. John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary, December 12th, quote, Goulburn lost all control of his temper. He has always, in such cases, a sort of convulsive agitation about him, and the tone in which he speaks is more insulting than the language that he uses, unquote.
Oh, boy.
This must have been bad. Can you imagine him screaming across that table? A shouting match, disrespect after all this time from August to December. Peace is now hinged on this tiny island in the Passamaquoddy Bay. Once more, the negotiations are at a breaking point. Just to keep the talks alive, the Americans agreed to let the British have the islands. Well, one more note is exchanged and one more conference, and then on Christmas Eve, December 24th, the treaty was signed on the basis of status quo antebellum. The Passamaquoddy Islands remained in the possession of Great Britain because of Henry Goulburn, and ownership to be determined by a future commission. They finally do return it in 1818, 4 years after the war was over. Henry Goulburn in this painting is the second from the left with his back turned to the signing of the treaty. Some say he's painted that way because he was ashamed of the terms of the treaty. He had expected much, much more. So on December 24th, the treaty was rushed off to London by stagecoach and sailboat. It was ratified in London, onto another sailboat in January of 1815. The same week, New Orleans is finally under attack. I don't know what it was like to be on a ship in January, but I can imagine the rain and sleet and building up on the ropes and the sails, and it must have been challenging. The treaty arrived in New York City on February 11th. President Madison first saw it on my birthday, February 14th, 1815. Congress and the Senate ratified the treaty. The President and Anthony St. John Baker exchanged ratifications on the 17th of February. War was declared over on February 18th. News of peace arrived here in Plattsburgh around the 15th or 16th and published in the Plattsburgh Republican on the 18th. And in February, people here in the North Country were in their winter survival mode. They were just trying to stay warm, feed their families, feed the livestock. I don't know how they celebrated, but let's sum it up here. Who won? What did we gain? What was resolved by the treaty? It definitely ended hostilities. None of the causes which led to the declaration of war were resolved by the treaty. Not one mention. With news of peace, many Americans considered the war a success. We stood up to Great Britain again. As an independent nation, trade opened up between the United States and Europe, helped our economy. The United States had a more united feeling and a sense of pride. Our navies gained respect on the lakes and the oceans. The Indians were the big losers. They lost support and protection of the Indians, which left them at the mercy of Western expansion. The British and Canadians successfully defended Canada from United States invasion. And two more points I want to make before we close. Looking back at 1776, American independence was partially won because of John Adams, one of the founding fathers of the country. Actual independence was won partially by his son, John Quincy Adams, in the War of 1812. That's all I have to say.
All right, we're going to pause just a moment. I don't suppose it was appropriate for me to make sidelong comments and giggling in the background when you were doing your presentation, but it's so important that this message be propagated just the way you're doing it, Vince, so that people will understand the value of the Battle of Plattsburgh in terms of the War of 1812. My goodness, Teddy Roosevelt knew how important it was, didn't he?
He did. He wrote about it. He said it was one of the most decisive battles of the war.
And we've spent a lot of time talking about that, and yet, how many young people do you know who've gotten their education here, who were stationed on Plattsburgh Air Force Base all those years, gone back to their respective homes and countries and states, who have no idea that the Battle of Plattsburgh even occurred? So you are an ambassador on so many levels, but you know what? It must make you feel good at the end of the day.
I do. I feel really good, and I just want to get the word out. It was significant for the political reasons behind it as well, not just that there was a big battle.
Well, you know, we've heard Keith Herculoe in his presentations and so many other people on both sides of the lake and north and south of the border talk about how significantly different our country would have been had that Treaty of Ghent not been negotiated by the likes of you and others during that time period. And when we say antebellum, we talk about the Civil War most often, but here we are in the War of 1812 and the Battle of Plattsburgh. And boy, if I wasn't a believer ahead of time, you have made a believer out of me now. What have you got over here on the table, Vince?
Well, what I have here is, this is the last page of the Treaty of Ghent. It's the signature page. And I saw that and I said, this is John Quincy Adams' seal. What did it look like? And this isn't a very good image of it. So I started researching it. And I finally found a good image online. And what led me to that and writing my next book, which is called The History of the Seal Used by John Quincy Adams.
Yep.
When I went to the Adams National Historic Park, they have a visitor center. They have a large mural about 20 feet long that shows the entire lineage of the Adams family from the early 1600s to into the 1900s. Right at the signing of the Treaty of Ghent, I looked down and they had an image of the wrong seal.
No, come on.
I said, that's wrong. I went to the curator. The curator says, this has been up here for many years. Nobody else has ever said
Well,
that.
of course not. I guess you
I said,
don't know
I'll prove
you,
it to
Vince.
you. So I wrote to the National Archives in London to get an image off of their treaty. I wrote to the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. to get an image on that treaty. I brought them together, and it's exactly the same one. The rest of the book talks about other treaties that he signed while he was in Europe, two other treaties. And it's the same seal he used on every one of them. So I brought that back to the curator of the Adams National Historic Park, and they changed the image on their Adams lineage.
You have had a greater impact than even I imagined, Vince. That's wonderful. So how did you get enough information for a whole book?
Did a lot of digging, and most of it was his diary. Again, I was reading way back when he went to Europe early in the 1790s. And he passed it on from generation to generation, and there are other books that also have wrong information about the treaty. And I went to the sources, and I wrote this little book specifically about his seal that he used in Europe.
You know, that happens so often. It's something we've talked about. You know how they say history repeats itself. Well, errors in history done by well-meaning historians are also perpetuated in history books and so on ad infinitum if somebody like Vince doesn't come along and say, hey, you guys,
Yeah.
that's the wrong seal. So were they a little bit contrite when you went back to them, or did he say,
They basically said, thank you very much.
And they
It's
changed it?
just, yes, they did.
I love it.
There's a new image there.
I love it. Now, you have handwritten the entire Treaty of Ghent.
Yes, I did. Again, this is about 26 pages long. It's only on one side,
Yep.
but I did it at the same format as
The
one that I
original.
got offline. This is the original writing from one of the secretaries in the commission, and every word is the same written crossed here, same size lettering. And this is, if you see the painting of the Treaty of Ghent, you'll see that this is about the same size image that's in that painting. So this is about the same size. It was interesting because I don't write very well,
I
and
think you
I have a
wrote
lot of
beautifully.
I have a lot of scribbles, and
You did beautifully. That took you
oh
2 weeks.
yeah, at least 2 weeks. Yep.
That was a guess. Now, okay. Do you have a copy of the entire diary?
No, I don't. The entire diary is electronically on the web.
So it's available.
It's available at the Massachusetts Historical Society website.
You've read half of it?
I've read, I might say about half.
I dare say,
Various pieces.
since you're going to live another 47 years or 50 years, that you will have an opportunity to read every word.
Oh my gosh. It's
Almost a part of your mission. I mean, you got the tall Puss in Boots traveling boots on, so you're into this thing, Vince.
Well, I had a mission. I wanted to read everything that he wrote on the Treaty of Ghent, his diary. He had letter books, he had journals, he had all the letters that he wrote too. There's letters that were sent. It's called Writings of John Quincy Adams. You can get in there, and most of the letters are there from the Secretary of State to the Secretary of State to other envoys to his wife. And one thing that again may be why some people have forgotten about the Battle of Plattsburgh is John Quincy's memoirs, written by his son, John Francis Adams, left out one of the most important days for the Battle of Plattsburgh, that is. October 28th, when news arrived about the Battle of Plattsburgh, is not in his memoirs.
Isn't that amazing?
It's missing. There are other days that are missing as well, but most people that are researching the war might say, oh, John Quincy was there. Get his memoirs. They're easy to read. It's in print. His diary is not in print.
Yeah.
It's in his handwriting. So people use his memoirs, and they don't know anything about the Battle of Plattsburgh because it's not in his memoirs.
Oh, my goodness. As I said at the outset of this program, recorded on November 24th, 2014, we are trying to keep the true history of the Battle of Plattsburgh, the War of 1812, and the Treaty of Ghent in perspective till the end of time. And this chronicle with Hometown Cable does that. And the other idea is to keep this history alive. We reached a crescendo on September 11th, 1814. We had some significant events happening around this area.
Yeah.
Calvin Castine, Hometown Cable, and my little part in our little corner did I don't know how many programs connected with the Battle of Plattsburgh this year, but
Yeah.
you know how many there are. You know how important it is to both of us to keep this alive because we do feel the history. But we also realized that after that celebration was over, a lot of people were going to get in the rocking chair and say, okay, next chapter.
Right.
The object for you and for me and for Calvin is to keep the idea alive.
Absolutely.
Because now you've explained to us how this whole thing, the negotiations for the Treaty of Ghent, continued on well into the new year, into into 1815.
Well, the treaty was signed on Christmas Eve,
Yeah.
but John Quincy didn't leave Ghent until I think it was January 26th.
Right.
He had his image painted by a Ghent painter, and in his uniform, actually. The other envoys, Henry Clay and John Quincy, went to England because John Quincy became minister to Great Britain, of all places, right after leaving there.
Isn't that amazing?
So he went over there to argue with them some more.
So the information about the Treaty of Ghent, well, it took a while to get back here, and it was well into the new year of 2015 before most of the people had any inkling that that had taken place.
That's true. The news traveled real slow in those days, and the news of the battle at New Orleans reached Washington about a week and a half before the treaty came across the ocean. So people were excited about the British defeat at New Orleans, and then they get the news of the peace treaty is signed, and they put it all together, and they said, hey, the war's over. And there was all kinds of celebrations and bonfires and dinners held to celebrate the peace.
And here we are 200 years later.
Yep.
That's wonderful. Now, you've got some significant events coming up. We're recording this on the 24th of November, and it won't be aired until after you've made your presentation on December 1st. But then you've got something coming up in June of 2015. Aren't you going down to?
No, not June. February 7th.
Oh, February
I'll be
7th.
at the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Museum in Saratoga Springs.
Okay, but after people see this, you're going to be so much in demand. I wonder how you can sleep with that hat on. I'm not sure.
Oh, I don't. I love it. I love the costume. When the seamstress that made the costume, for the first time after putting it together, she says, okay, try the first fitting. And we put it on, and she said, that's scary. Because I look so much like him.
You really do, and I'm so glad Calvin had you stand next to that painting so we could figure that out.
But one thing I want to mention is, in keeping with what you're saying about the War of 1812, Battle of Plattsburgh, it's here in this museum. Come in and see it, see the video, the introduction video, take a walk around the various exhibits, the interpretive center, the paintings on the walls, and relive what it was like in 1814.
As I said before, we're so delighted to have been part of the process of to see the creation of this wonderful group of museums on the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base, to hear just before I came over today of the final decision of what's going to happen as that oldest building on this property, the old barracks, the old stone barracks, is going to be reused, and people will be able to go there and have a sip of some kind of home brew and maybe see some interpretive things going on. That makes my heart feel really good. And to know this little museum is here, that people like you and Keith Hercolo and all the others have been so responsible for having that happen, and to know that your friends and my friends from the far corners of the earth can come back here to visit Plattsburgh Air Force Base. Maybe they were stationed here like you were way back when. Come back and see what we've done. The reuse of this air base is pretty fantastic. In retrospect, you have to agree, Vince.
I agree 100%.
Vince, thanks so much.
Thanks, Gordy.
Vince
Thanks, Calvin.
Puliafico,
Yes, sir. That's
I
it.
did pretty good.
Very good.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I not only learned an awful lot about the Treaty of Ghent, the Battle of Plattsburgh, the War of 1812, but I learned about the time you and I spent in that
Flight simulator.
flight simulator. What year was that?
Oh, 1996 when they closed the base,
Is
I
that
think. it was?
possible? 1995. That's
95, yeah.
truly amazing. Thanks so much. You're the best. Thanks to our viewers for their comments and suggestions. Thanks to the good Lord that gives us the strength to stand up here again and do yet another opening and another show. And thanks two, for those people who choose to support our little corner and what Calvin does with Hometown Cable by writing a generous check, so this program can continue far into the future. Send it to Calvin Castine, care of Hometown Cable, 1477 Ridge Road, Champlain. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little